headlines, the heartbreak. But now the phone rang less. The offers slowed. And though she remained radiant on stage, her absence from the mainstream felt deliberate. Hollywood's quiet way of saying, "We've moved on." She wasn't controversial enough to trend, nor young enough to repackage. And in that slow, silent exit, a deeper kind of tragedy set in. Because Diana Ross never got the true acknowledgement she deserved, not while she was still here to receive it. She paved roads for black women in music, broke barriers that were cemented in racism and misogyny, and yet, her name was often missing from the conversations that claimed to honor trailblazers. Her peers, Aretha, Tina, Whitney, each earned their mythic status, but Diana? She remained somewhere between icon and ghost, celebrated in short bursts but rarely honored in full. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the silence, but the selective memory. Even her relationships with her children, as loving as they appeared, weren't immune to the ripple effects of fame. They saw their mother less as a person and more as a monument, and though she adored them, poured into them, tried to make up for the years she was gone on tour or locked in contracts she couldn't escape. There was always a quiet guilt that lingered. Did they know her, or just the version the world projected? The Diana Ross in family photos was warm, soft, affectionate. But the one backstage, alone after a concert, was often still haunted by the girl from Detroit who never fully got to grow up. Aging for her wasn't just a biological process, it was emotional exile. She watched the world change from behind oversized sunglasses, smiling, always smiling, even as time took its toll. Her voice, once effortless, began to waver. Her steps on stage, once so commanding, grew more measured. But she never stopped performing, because stopping would have meant facing the full weight of everything she had sacrificed. And so she continued, gracefully, defiantly, beautifully, because that's what survivors do. But even survival, when done long enough, begins to feel like grief. Diana Ross never needed pity. She needed to be seen, fully, without expectation, without critique, without the constant demand to inspire or represent or prove herself worthy of the pedestal others placed her on. And in this later chapter of her life, now in her 80s, what remains is not a woman diminished, but a woman still searching for peace, for softness, for a world that doesn't require her to perform just to be loved. That's the heartbreak, not that Diana Ross fell, but that she was never really allowed to rest. Now, as Diana Ross steps into her 81st year, what remains is not just the legacy of a superstar, but the quiet aftermath of a woman who gave everything to be extraordinary in a world that rarely let her just be. She still appears in glimpses, on stage at tribute shows, walking slowly but elegantly down red carpets, her voice now softer, her movements more measured, her eyes carrying the weight of years that never truly allowed her to exhale. Fans still chant her name, still reach for her hand, still cry at the sight of the woman who once ruled the airwaves and defined a generation. But behind that adoration lies something sadder, the realization that this woman, so long held as royalty, was also imprisoned by the very crown the world insisted she wear. Diana Ross isn't just a singer. She's a mirror, reflecting the price of fame, of being the first, of always having to shine while silently breaking. In interviews, she speaks with gratitude, always polished, always warm. But if you look closer, listen closer, you can hear the grief in her pauses. The way she sometimes talks about Florence Ballard, or mentions Motown with a careful neutrality, reveals the ghosts she still carries. Not every friendship was mended, not every wound was healed, and not every apology came. There's something deeply heartbreaking about watching someone so strong for so long slowly retreat from the spotlight, not with bitterness, but with quiet exhaustion. She doesn't announce retirement, doesn't make grand speeches about her departure, because in many ways, Diana Ross has been saying goodbye for years. A little more each time the cameras flash, a little more each time she sings a final note and walks off stage alone. Even surrounded by family, by love, by loyal fans, there's a lingering sense that Diana's deepest longing was never fully met. To be loved not just for the power of her image, but for the softness of her soul. She spent a lifetime being bulletproof, but no one asked what that kind of armor costs. Now in her stillness, she's not chasing headlines. She's not chasing charts. She's chasing peace. The kind she was never given at 20, 30, or even 50. And while the world continues to celebrate her greatest hits and historic achievements, very few truly acknowledge the depth of what she endured. Because what's most tragic isn't that Diana Ross is aging, or even that she's stepping away. It's that the world never stopped asking her to be magnificent long enough for her to just be. She was the dream, the blueprint, the diamond they polished until it bled. And now, she lives quietly in a world that is far too loud, her light no less radiant. But her voice, once booming with command, now whispering truths that too few have heard. Diana Ross will forever be remembered as the queen of Motown, the voice behind timeless love songs, the woman who broke through barriers no one else dared to approach. But if you strip away the stage lights, the fashion, the fame, what you'll find is a woman who was always more fragile than the world allowed her to admit. A woman who smiled through loss, persevered through heartbreak, and performed through pain. And perhaps now, at last, she deserves something greater than applause. She deserves rest. She deserves softness. She deserves the kind of peace she gave away to the world for decades, just to make us all believe in something beautiful. She was the voice of a generation, the face of Motown, and the woman who taught the world that elegance, grace, and power could exist in one unstoppable presence. Diana Ross didn't just lead the Supremes, she defined them. Her voice soared across decades, from the civil rights movement to disco's golden age, always shimmering with a kind of aching beauty that made every note unforgettable. But behind the glamour, behind the sequined gowns and spotlight smiles, lived a woman who has quietly carried decades of heartbreak. From bitter feuds and broken friendships to a series of painful romantic disappointments, Diana Ross's journey hasn't been the fairy tale so many assumed it was. The price of being first, of being legendary, often came with unbearable loneliness. She didn't just fight to be seen, she fought to stay whole in a world that constantly pulled her apart. Now, at 81, as the spotlight grows dimmer and the voices around her quieter, the tragedy of Diana Ross begins to reveal itself in full. Not because she failed, but because the world expected her to be perfect, always, flawless, unbreakable, divine. But she wasn't divine. She was human, and the pain she buried beneath diamonds and microphones has never truly gone away. In the end, Diana Ross gave everything she had to her music, her image, her legacy, and the cost of that sacrifice is far more heartbreaking than most will ever understand. This is not just the story of a superstar. It's the slow unraveling of a woman who had to wear strength like armor, even when she was falling apart inside. Long before Diana Ross became a global icon, before the gowns and the Grammys, there was a little girl in Detroit with a dream so big it barely fit inside the walls of her family's modest home. Born in 1944 into a segregated America, Diana learned early that being seen wasn't guaranteed, and being heard meant fighting through a world that didn't believe black girls could be stars. But she kept singing in church, on street corners, at school talent shows, wherever someone would listen. That voice, clear, vulnerable, strong, wasn't just a gift, it was a lifeline. It carried her through a childhood where money was tight, expectations were heavy, and opportunity was rare. When she joined the Primates, later renamed the Supremes, she was just a teenager, but even then she stood out. Not just for her voice, but for her presence. Berry Gordy saw it instantly. He didn't just see a singer, he saw a star. And that's where the story takes its glittering turn and its heartbreaking twist. Diana Ross was pushed forward, front and center, while the other girls were quietly ushered to the background. It wasn't her fault. She didn't ask to be the face of the group, but it created cracks that would only deepen. Behind the scenes, jealousy brewed, friendships strained, and Diana, barely out of high school, was suddenly labeled a diva, ambitious, difficult. The world saw a woman rising. But inside she was breaking, because the higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. Her friendship with Florence Ballard, once inseparable, deteriorated under the weight of fame and corporate manipulation. Flo, who had started the group with Diana, would later spiral into poverty and despair, dying far too young and far too forgotten. And though Diana never spoke of it publicly, those who knew her said it haunted her for years. But she didn't have time to grieve. Motown didn't allow room for vulnerability. She was trained to be polished, precise, controlled, always smiling, always graceful, always perfect. She became what the world demanded, even as she slowly lost sight of who she truly was. And that's the silent tragedy few ever noticed. Diana Ross was always working, always performing, not just on stage, but in life. The voice that soared on "Where Did Our Love Go" and "Ain't No Mountain High Enough" was the same voice that struggled to say what she needed behind closed doors. Every note she sang came with pressure. Pressure to represent, to uplift, to never falter. Being a black woman at the top of the charts in the 1960s wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. Every mistake was magnified, every triumph was expected, and the further she went, the lonelier it got. Even her romantic life, often glamorized in tabloids, was riddled with pain. Her complicated relationship with Berry Gordy, the very man who discovered her, became a quiet burden, intimate, influential, and inevitably destructive. They had a child together, but not a future. And Diana, ever the professional, never let the public see how much that loss cost her. By the time she stepped out as a solo artist, the world cheered, but the woman behind the legend was already carrying decades of emotional weight. And as she smiled for the cameras, attended premieres, and sang to packed audiences, very few ever asked how she truly felt. Because Diana Ross was never allowed to fall apart. She was only ever allowed to shine. As Diana Ross entered the 1970s, now a solo artist and international sensation, the lights burned brighter, but so did the shadows behind them. She was no longer just the face of the Supremes. She was the name on the marquee, the headline act, the woman whose every move was watched, judged, and magnified. And yet, with every award, every sold-out concert, every magazine cover, came an unbearable sense of isolation. Stardom didn't lift her, it trapped her. The walls of luxury closed in like glass, beautiful, see-through, and cold. Her relationship with Berry Gordy, once the passionate backbone of her early success, had collapsed under the weight of power imbalances and unmet emotional needs. And though she gave birth to his child Rhonda, their bond didn't survive. Diana moved on, but love was never easy to find. Not when the world treated her like a goddess, but rarely like a human being. Her marriage to Robert Silverstein, though blessed with 2 daughters, was turbulent and short-lived. She searched for someone who could see her beyond the legend, but the truth was, most people only saw the icon. And the heartbreak came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who didn't truly know her. The stronger she appeared to the world, the more invisible her real pain became. That pain only deepened as she tried to raise her children while living under the constant scrutiny of an unforgiving industry. She was expected to be flawless in every role: performer, mother, style icon, cultural leader. There was no space for exhaustion, no room for breakdowns. And when she did break down, as she did privately, away from the cameras, it was seen as weakness, as something to be hidden. Even in later years, when stories emerged about her being difficult or demanding, few paused to consider why. They didn't see a woman fighting to protect the last pieces of her identity in a system that had commodified her since she was a teenager. They didn't see the grief she carried for lost friendships, lost time, and a life spent trying to be perfect for everyone else. Diana Ross didn't have the luxury of falling apart in public. So she fell apart in silence. Her arrest in 2002 for a DUI shocked the world, but those closest to her weren't surprised. It was the culmination of decades of internalized pain finally surfacing. She apologized. She recovered. But the cracks in her facade had already begun to show. And while she returned to the stage, still dazzling, still radiant, those who truly watched closely could see the difference. The voice was still powerful, but the fire behind the eyes flickered. This wasn't just fatigue, it was emotional exhaustion. And if you're still watching, if you feel the weight of this story, the cost of being a legend, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more powerful untold stories. And leave a comment. What's your favorite Diana Ross moment? Let's honor her not just for the star she was, but for the human being she's always been. Because behind every diamond-studded performance was a woman who bled privately for the world's entertainment. And even as the applause thundered around her, Diana Ross often walked back to her dressing room alone, the silence after the spotlight reminding her that the stage she conquered never promised her peace. That's the tragedy. when the world loves the version of you they created, but not the real you who's been quietly asking for love all along. As Diana Ross moved through her 40s and 50s, the industry she had once dominated began to shift around her. Colder now, younger, faster, less reverent of legends and more obsessed with novelty. The world she helped build was forgetting her in real time, trading soul for spectacle, melody for marketability. And for someone who had spent a lifetime giving everything to the stage, the microphone, and the camera, the fading of the spotlight was more painful than most could ever understand. For Diana, performing wasn't just a career, it was survival. It was the one place she felt powerful, in control, able to transcend the hurt, the